I never imagined I'd become the kind of man who'd find himself living in solitude by a body of water. After 22 years dedicated to emergency infrastructure restoration, tackling wildfires, deluges, even catastrophic landslides across the western United States, I believed I had witnessed and managed all the turmoil I could possibly endure. However, nothing could have truly prepared me for the insidious, gradual form of ruin that arrived, clad in polite khakis and bearing the insignia of a homeowners association. My name is Tom Keller. I am 58 years of age, a widower, and the proprietor of 8 acres situated just beyond the confines of Ridgepoint Meadows, one of those meticulously manicured suburban enclaves characterized by uniform mailboxes and stringent regulations on lawn length. I acquired my land long before the encroaching development began its expansion. In those days, it was simply me, my beloved wife, and a tranquil lake nourished by a natural spring and a network of subterranean channels that I grew to cherish as a dear companion. Following Julie's passing from ovarian cancer, a swift and brutal affliction, I found myself unable to tolerate the cacophony of the urban environment any longer. Consequently, I opted for early retirement, divested our townhouse in Fort Collins, and relocated here permanently. The lake became my sanctuary. My mornings were filled with the aroma of coffee and the melodious chirping of birds. In the evenings, I would recline on the dock, observing the water's surface shimmer under the moon's gentle glow. It wasn't a perfect idyll, but it was unequivocally mine. It felt like reclaiming my capacity to breathe. Initially, the encroaching construction did not elicit any concern from me. Ridgepoint Meadows was developing on the opposite slope of the hill, and the HOA seemed preoccupied with managing speed bumps and organizing seasonal neighborhood gatherings. We would exchange polite nods from a distance. Their community newsletters, despite my not being a resident, would invariably find their way into my mailbox. I paid it little mind. Then, the official communications began. The first was a letter, seemingly innocuous enough. The HOA announced it was exploring avenues for community enrichment, specifically concerning shared waterfront amenities. A few weeks later, a survey team materialized at the edge of my tree line, armed with clipboards, high-visibility vests, and an air of proprietary entitlement. I approached them and introduced myself. "Gentlemen," I stated, "you're aware that this is private property." The team leader, a lean individual with meticulously gelled hair and a perpetually active Bluetooth earpiece, offered a patronizing smile. "According to the HOA's most recent plat map, sir," he replied as if humoring a child, "the lake falls within Ridgepoint Meadows' designated shared utility easement." I let out a chuckle, an audible burst of laughter. "Absolutely not," I declared, retrieving my well-worn property documentation. I possessed deeds dating back to 1968, detailed topographical surveys, and a notarized water rights certification from the county's environmental agency. "This lake is my sole property. The HOA's jurisdiction ends at that line of oak trees." He nodded, ostentatiously scrolling through his tablet, then offered a perfunctory shrug. "We will forward this information to the board." Weeks elapsed. I assumed that was the conclusion of the matter. I resumed the task of refinishing my dock, checking on the muskrat habitats, and making repairs to the vintage canoe that Julie and I had acquired on our 10th wedding anniversary. Then, the barges appeared. I heard the low rumble at dawn, a flatbed truck laboriously backing down the HOA's gravel access road, transporting what appeared to be prefabricated floating platforms and construction machinery. I drove my truck up the ridge only to find the HOA president herself, Karen Whitfield, a woman whose name I'd previously only encountered on mailers, orchestrating the traffic flow as if she were the sovereign of the subdivision. She was attired in white capris, a Ridgepoint Meadows windbreaker, and mirrored sunglasses, despite the sun not yet having breached the tree line. "Karen," I called out, stepping from my vehicle, "what in blazes is transpiring here?" She turned, her expression visibly contorted with annoyance. "We are in the process of installing Ridgepoint Meadows' new floating establishment," she announced, as though I were a mere spectator rather than the proprietor whose water body they were about to infringe upon. It's a community-driven initiative designed to foster greater resident engagement and enhance the value of our lakeside amenities. I blinked in disbelief. Your lakeside amenities? You have enjoyed exclusive access to this body of water for years, she stated, her tone cool and clipped. However, our community development plans received full approval from the HOA board and were pre-registered with the city's Parks and Recreation Department. It is time for the lake to serve everyone, not just a hermit. The sheer absurdity of the situation rendered me momentarily speechless. I reopened my folder, displaying the pertinent documents. She dismissed them with a wave. Our legal counsel has thoroughly reviewed all relevant materials. If you wish to submit a formal objection, you are welcome to present it at our upcoming HOA meeting. And so the campaign commenced. On that very day, they began submerging anchors into the water. A team of divers descended and installed the foundational supports for the platforms. Buoyant panels, garish plastic monstrosities in a blinding shade of blue, began to proliferate across the tranquil surface, resembling an epidemic. I observed in utter incredulity as construction equipment, delivered via barge, unloaded prefabricated structures destined to become the new Ridgepoint Meadows floating establishment and eatery. Each hammer blow struck against a structural beam felt like a personal affront. Yet what caused me more distress than the incessant noise or the ceaseless construction was the deafening silence emanating from the city administration. When I lodged complaints with the zoning and planning departments, I was informed that the HOA had a conditional use permit pending review. My inquiries to Parks and Wildlife yielded the response that the lake was not officially designated as a protected habitat. It is privately owned, I emphasized. However, a city official stated over the phone, it appears to function as a common area under the revised boundary maps submitted by the HOA. Do you possess any documentation to the contrary? I have 30 years' worth of documentation, I retorted sharply. In that case, you may require legal representation. I terminated the call. That evening, I sat on my dock, my feet dangling just above the water's surface. The usual chorus of frogs was conspicuously absent. The familiar rustling of nocturnal birds, egrets, loons, mallards, was missing. The harsh glare of the construction floodlights reflected off the lake's surface like a sterile, misplaced surgical lamp. I gazed down at the water, so placid it resembled polished glass. Concealed beneath its surface lay a manually operated release system engineered in the 1970s, predating current zoning ordinances. I'd not accessed it in years, yet I retained a vivid recollection of its entire schematic, every lever, every gate valve. Julie had once playfully remarked, "You seem to have a greater affection for that lake than for people." That night, I was no longer certain she was mistaken, and for the first time in a considerable period, I felt a profound shift occur within me. Something somber, something ancient, something akin to unyielding determination. It did not take long for their ostensible vision to devolve into something grotesque. Within a week, the lake I had once revered resembled a chaotic construction zone adrift atop a life support system. They proclaimed it progress. I deemed it desecration. Karen and her select coterie of board members orchestrated a public unveiling the following Saturday. Powerful loudspeakers boomed across the water, heralding the commencement of a new era in Ridgepoint Meadows community living. Food vendors lined the shore, a ribbon-cutting ceremony was held, and drone cameras hummed overhead. From my dock, I observed them broadcast the entire event live on their Facebook page, utilizing my lake as their trophy, as if my presence were entirely inconsequential. They had not merely commandeered the water, they had fundamentally rebranded it. A resplendent new banner, stretched taut across the floating scaffolding, proudly proclaimed, "Coming soon, Ridgepoint Meadows Floating Café and Bistro, where community meets serenity." They had even altered the lake's designation on the HOA website to Ridgepoint Meadows Lake. Just like that, as if decades of legal ownership, diligent conservation efforts, and sheer hard work could be summarily eradicated with a simple WordPress login. I made every effort to maintain my composure. I attempted to navigate the situation through appropriate channels. I composed numerous letters. I meticulously compiled my original deed, the water rights certificate, historical plat maps, and a county memorandum from 2009 explicitly stating that the HOA's established boundaries did not encompass the lakebed. I dispatched copies to the HOA board, the City Hall, and the Department of Natural Resources. I even left printed informational packets at the HOA clubhouse and discreetly placed one beneath Karen's windshield wiper. No response was forthcoming. Instead, the HOA escalated their efforts. They distributed a beautifully typeset community vision statement to every mailbox. The text read, as if it had been penned by a marketing firm striving to peddle an idealized utopia. The Ridgepoint Meadows Floating Café and Bistro will serve as a year-round nexus for families, seniors, and guests, it proclaimed, offering farm-to-table culinary experiences, kayak rentals, and weekly lakeside concerts. It will be a celebration of togetherness, contemplation, and local pride upon the tranquil waters. We share, they declared. We share. There was no acknowledgement of my existence, no mention that the very serene waters they lauded were the private property of an individual still very much alive and actively resisting. They began engaging contractors from out of state, presumably to circumvent local gossip. The lake's surface was partitioned with buoys and floating dividers. A steel frame kitchen module was lowered onto two pontoons, while welders, clad in protective goggles, toiled through the night. The metallic clanging echoed through the valley, each reverberation a physical blow against my very being. And throughout this entire ordeal, the local wildlife began to disappear. The majestic great blue heron that had nested on the eastern bank vanished. The turtles that had basked on my floating log ceased their visits. Algae began to proliferate in dense patches near the construction zone, agitated by fuel runoff from the barge engines. Every morning, I meticulously measured the nitrate levels resulting from the runoff. I documented these changes through extensive photography, yet every environmental complaint I filed received the same response. Permit under review, monitoring ongoing, no confirmed violations. I wasn't merely losing dominion over the lake. I felt as though I were losing myself. On one particular afternoon, I attempted to engage a younger board member, a man named David Tren, who previously jogged past my property each morning. He appeared to possess a modicum of conscience, perhaps even a trace of discomfort regarding the entire undertaking. I encountered him as he was securing the temporary tool storage at the edge of the lake. "David," I initiated, "do you truly comprehend the implications of your actions? This is not merely an underutilized parcel of Ridgepoint Meadows. This is my land. That water rightfully belongs to me." He cast furtive glances around, lowering his voice. "Tom, I understand. I truly do. But Karen is adamant that the community has a rightful claim to it. She repeatedly cites a clause pertaining to undeveloped adjacent properties serving the common good. That clause is applicable only to HOA-maintained easements," I stated emphatically. "This lake has never been subject to Ridgepoint Meadows jurisdiction. You cannot simply erect a floating dining establishment on someone else's property and rationalize it as being for the public welfare." He lowered his gaze to his clipboard, murmuring, "I'm just a volunteer board member, Tom. I don't make those decisions." "No," I replied, "but you will be implicated in a lawsuit if this continues." His eyes widened infinitesimally. I was not bluffing. However, I refrained from initiating legal action. Not yet. The associated legal expenses would undoubtedly deplete my resources, and I was acutely aware of the protracted strategies employed by HOAs, their tendency to mire lawsuits in procedural complexities until the opposition either capitulated or faced financial ruin. Furthermore, I still harbored a flicker of hope that someone within the city administration would eventually acknowledge the injustice. That hope was extinguished 2 days later upon my receipt of an officially formatted envelope in my mailbox. It was not from the HOA. It originated from the city's Planning and Development Office. I opened it with a sense of trepidation. This letter serves to inform you that the Ridgepoint Meadows Homeowners Association has submitted an application for the retroactive integration of Lake Parcel 12C into the Ridgepoint Meadows Civic Usage Zone under Ordinance 47F. Retroactive integration. They were attempting to alter the official boundaries after construction had already begun. Buried within the fine print, the notice stipulated a 10-business-day period for me to file a formal objection. Following this time frame, the plat map would be amended and the lake, my lake, would be officially designated as a civic utility resource. I sank heavily onto the edge of my truck bed, my hands trembling. This was no longer mere audacity. It was a calculated maneuver designed to nullify my claim before any effective resistance could be mounted. They were proceeding under the guise of legality, or at least they were meticulously crafting an appearance of legitimacy. That night I gazed out at the lake, its once serene surface now marred by intrusive lights and discordant sounds. At its center, the skeletal framework of the floating café loomed like a mocking effigy of everything Julie and I had striven to safeguard. The dock, where we had once observed fireflies dance in the twilight, was now cordoned off with a stark caution construction area sign zip-tied to my very own railing. I remained there for an extended period, the official documentation clutched tightly in my hand before retreating indoors. Sleep eluded me. Instead, I unlocked the antiquated metal cabinet situated in the garage. Within it resided a blueprint cylinder that had remained undisturbed for 15 years. My fingers hesitated over the cap, for a deep-seated intuition told me what lay coiled inside. The following morning, as I unrolled the blueprint across my kitchen table, everything irrevocably changed. The edges were yellowed with age, the paper creased and delicate, yet the ink remained remarkably crisp. I traced the intricate contours with my fingertip, a flood of memories accompanying each line, each precise measurement. My father had meticulously drafted these plans in 1972, during a time when this land remained unincorporated and the lake was little more than a spring-fed depression sculpted by glacial meltwater. He had designed the dock, the culverts, the overflow catchments, and most critically, the emergency release valve. A deep, narrow channel equipped with a hand-crank gate concealed beneath a stone well at the eastern bank. This entire system had never been utilized, not once, yet it remained in place. I had diligently maintained it over the intervening years, ensuring it remained oiled, clear, and secure, for my father had instilled in me a profound belief in resilience, and I, in turn, had unwavering faith in him. The system was engineered to fully drain the lake within a mere 24 hours. And in that pivotal moment, as I studied the plans that had outlived my father, I grasped the undeniable truth that I had been desperately trying to avoid confronting. No amount of polite correspondence or meticulously prepared informational packets would deter them. They were not simply proceeding with construction without my consent, they were systematically erasing me, eradicating the very essence of what this lake represented, and I could not, in good conscience, permit such an outcome. The very next day, the intensity of the construction efforts escalated dramatically. The steel superstructure of the restaurant rose with astonishing rapidity. Cranes hoisted the wall sections into place from the shoreline, while a flotilla of barges secured the floating foundation with heavy industrial chains. The structure itself bore the sleek, modern aesthetic of a high-end resort catalog, complete with expansive glass facades, solar-paneled roofing, and even LED-illuminated railings that cycled through a spectrum of colors after dusk. And precisely at its center, a banner rendered in elegant gold cursive declared, "Opening soon." Neighbors congregated along the shoreline, observing the spectacle as if it were a grand fireworks display. Children on their bicycles pedaled to the edge of my property, their faces pressed against the fence line, eager for a closer look. HOA volunteers distributed flyers detailing the restaurant's impending grand opening weekend, listing tantalizing menu samples, scheduled live music performances, and with a cruel irony, environmentally sourced fish from Ridgepoint Meadows Lake. My fish. That same afternoon, Karen herself marched directly to my fence, clipboard in hand. I observed her approach from the comfort of my porch, a mug of coffee warming my hands. "Tom," she called out with an exaggeratedly cheerful tone, "I just wanted to drop off the community guidelines for the launch event." I remained silent, offering no acknowledgement. She paused, then stepped closer to the gate. You'll be pleased to know we've implemented stringent safety measures to prevent runoff contamination, she continued. The structure is entirely self-contained. All waste products will be transported off-site. How exceptionally thoughtful, I replied dryly, without shifting my position. She beamed as if I had offered her a personal compliment. We're even coordinating with the city for optional kayak excursions around the lake. Families are going to absolutely adore it. It is not your lake. Her smile faltered for the barest fraction of a second, then reasserted itself with renewed vigor. It is now, she stated, her voice soft yet undeniably smug. I nearly uttered the words right then and there. I hope you know how to swim. But I suppressed the impulse. Instead, I allowed her to deposit the clipboard at my gate and depart, the crunch of her heels on the gravel sounding eerily like the triumphant march of a victorious army. Over the ensuing days, I meticulously observed the installation of floating walkways, the securing of pontoons, and the finalization of interior fittings. Contractors diligently drilled into anchored steel beams, their laughter mingling with the aroma of boxed lunches. A hired chef, sporting a Ridgepoint Meadows polo shirt, conducted a live-streamed sneak peek of the kitchen operations, standing on what had once been a serene lily pad bed. Within the confines of my home, I began my own preparations. I meticulously copied every blueprint page, scanned every permit denial I had received, and even meticulously drafted a chronological timeline of the ongoing construction, anticipating the possibility of future legal proceedings. While I harbored no illusions about achieving true justice in a courtroom, given the considerable financial resources of HOAs, I recognized the necessity of maintaining a clear mind and executing my actions with precision. This necessitated gaining access to the Valve housing. On the third night following Karen's visit, I donned my waders, retrieved my flashlight, and made my way through the dense tree line to the eastern periphery of the lake. The moonlight cast a shimmering luminescence upon the water's surface, tranquil and silent, save for the occasional creaking sound emanating from the floating structure situated far across the lake. I carefully navigated the undergrowth until I reached the ancient stone well. It was obscured by thick brambles, the kind of hidden location that would remain unnoticed by anyone not actively searching for it. I gently pushed aside the branches and knelt beside the circular hatch. A ring of rust clung stubbornly to its edge, but the bolts remained firm. Employing my father's old wrench, I painstakingly loosened the cap and then lifted it with deliberate slowness. The interior exhaled the distinct aroma of damp iron and lingering moss. I directed my flashlight beam downward. There it was, the manual crank, the interlocking gear teeth, the sturdy gate lever, all intact, awaiting activation. I closed the hatch with care and discreetly recovered it. That night, sleep remained elusive. My thoughts were consumed by the imminent moment of the cafe's grand opening, the smug pronouncements, the aerial drone footage, the celebratory toasts raised upon my lake, fueled by expensive wine and profound ignorance. They had transformed my personal sorrow into a public spectacle. I vividly recalled constructing the dock alongside Julie, her hands stained with fresh paint. The infectious sound of her laughter when the canoe capsized, sending us both plunging into the cool water. The floating lanterns we used to release on our anniversary, each one a silent tribute to another year we had shared. I remembered the heavy silence that descended after her diagnosis, and the peculiar stillness of the lake in the days following her departure, as if it too were in mourning. This was no longer merely a dispute over property lines. It was a battle for memory, for love, for the fundamental right to grieve in peace. The following morning, I received a certified letter from the HOA's legal firm. "Dear Mr. Keller," it began, "it has come to our attention that you have repeatedly trespassed upon Ridgepoint Meadows Community Development Grounds and have engaged in verbal harassment of contractors on site. Please be advised that any further incidents may result in legal action and the issuance of a restraining order. Furthermore, any interference with HOA-sanctioned property will be subject to prosecution, to the fullest extent of the law. The accusation was patently ludicrous. They had constructed their enterprise upon my lake, and now they were threatening to ban me from my own property. That evening, I sat on the dock and watched the restaurant's lights cast flickering reflections across the water's surface. The lake remained still, yet I could sense a palpable pulse beneath its placid exterior, a mounting pressure. They remained utterly oblivious to the secrets hidden beneath their floating fantasy. They had no comprehension of what my father had meticulously engineered. They were entirely unaware of my own capacity for action when pushed to the absolute limit. The water began to undergo a noticeable transformation even before the human interference became widely apparent. By the second week of construction, the lake had transitioned from a crystal-clear, reflective mirror to a murky, uninviting shade of green. One did not require a laboratory analysis to ascertain that it was profoundly unwell. A visible film of iridescence floated along the perimeter of the restaurant structure, oily and shimmering with rainbow hues under the sunlight. The ducks that had once congregated near the cattails had completely abandoned the shoreline. I observed one such duck struggling, its leg ensnared in a piece of discarded plastic netting. The HOA, however, chose to post these developments on their Facebook page. Another beautiful sunset at Ridge Point Meadows Lake, the caption read. Floating cafe nearing completion, grand opening soon. Our residents deserve this splendor. I responded to one of their posts with a comment. This lake is privately owned. Construction runoff is decimating the fish population. Water rights are being flagrantly violated. This is not beauty, it is blatant theft. 10 minutes later, my comment had been deleted. 10 minutes after that, I found myself permanently blocked from their page. Each morning, I diligently collected water samples and dispatched them to an independent laboratory in Denver. I meticulously documented instances of fuel leakage, significant pH fluctuations, and the presence of trace levels of nitrates and detergents. Daily, I photographed the increasingly dense algae blooms that were flourishing around the construction site. Meanwhile, the city's review of the HOA's application for retroactive zoning inclusion remained in a state of perpetual delay. And then came the fish. Hundreds of them, bluegill, perch, and even the koi I had introduced years ago, lay dead, their bellies facing upward along the eastern shore. Their eyes were clouded, their scales flaking away from their bodies. I stood amidst them, a profound sense of despair gripping my gut, recalling how Julie used to toss breadcrumbs to them while dangling her bare feet in the water. I contacted environmental services. A young man named Carter answered the phone. He sounded utterly bored. Sir, he stated, we have your previous complaints on file. Unfortunately, as the HOA's construction activities have not been legally classified as invasive or in violation of current codes, there is little we can do until the final inspection is completed. They are systematically destroying everything in that lake. I understand your frustration. No, you do not, I countered. This is not merely a development project. This is the unraveling of an entire ecosystem. This is where my wife's cremated remains were entrusted to the earth and water. This is the final living remnant of her presence, and they're dismantling it for a trivial dining experience. A heavy silence followed. Finally, a voice responded, I will flag your concerns, but we require more than personal accounts for official action. After I ended the call, the calculated efforts to discredit me truly commenced. I began to catch wind of rumors, whispered at the fuel station, the hardware store, even within the church walls. Phrases like Tom is being difficult again, or he always felt the lake belonged solely to him, but the official records suggest otherwise. The Ridgepoint Meadows newsletter featured a profile on Karen, highlighting her vision for transforming neglected spaces into something extraordinary. She spoke of the restaurant as a unifying force, a celebration of our shared natural beauty. I recognized a photograph within the article. It was taken from my own private dock, the very structure I had painstakingly constructed. It was now being presented as a communal lakeside amenity. The ultimate blow arrived in the form of a flyer affixed to every tree and lamppost along our neighborhood thoroughfares. Cease the negativity. Embrace progress. One person's discontent should not overshadow the collective enjoyment of Point Meadows. The lake is now ours. Let us move forward together. No names were attached, no author identified, yet everyone understood the veiled accusation. David Tran, who used to greet me with his usual morning jog, now averted his gaze when passing my home. Even Rudy, the mail carrier with whom I'd often discuss fishing, began delivering my mail with an unnerving quietude. I had been cast as the antagonist, the embittered recluse clinging to a waterway that no longer seemed to belong to me in anyone's eyes. And their ultimate goal was to provoke a breakdown. Karen in particular seemed to anticipate it. She was waiting for me to lash out, to commit some act of vandalism, to raise my voice at a meeting, or to initiate a costly lawsuit that would inevitably end in public defeat. This was the Homeowners Association's strategy: to make the opponent appear unreasonable, then portray their opposition as the genuine problem. But I didn't falter. I strategized. Late one evening, I returned to my workshop. My father's original blueprint spread before me. I studied the intricate details of the old drainage system, noting the 2 inlet chambers, the gravel filtration basin, and the primary release gate situated 30 feet below the eastern shoreline. There were only 2 mechanisms for its operation. One, a hydraulic pump long since rendered inoperable by corrosion, and the other, a manual crank system concealed beneath the well I had discovered days prior. I meticulously oiled the threads, restored the tension lever's functionality, and fabricated a replacement cog for a missing part in my own garage. Upon completion, I carefully resecured everything, leaving no trace of my work. 2 days later, Karen orchestrated a community gathering at the lake, a premature unveiling of sorts, complete with a ribbon-cutting ceremony, musical entertainment, and a catered buffet set upon floating tables anchored to the shore. A local news crew was even present, capturing footage of smiling residents traversing the newly constructed floating boardwalk. I observed the proceedings from the edge of the tree line. Karen, adorned in a smart blue pantsuit and pearls, was engaging in interviews, exuding an air of authority. She gestured towards the boathouse structure behind her, its gleaming windows reflecting the sunlight like a promise. "This endeavor embodies what can be achieved when neighbors unite," she proclaimed into the microphone. "This lake is no longer a neglected corner of the county. It serves as a beacon of unity." Unity. The word resonated in my mind as I returned home that night. I stood at the water's edge, the harsh glare of the cafe's floodlights painting the now murky surface. The lake exuded a foul odor of decay and chemical pollutants. Somewhere in the distance, a heron drifted aimlessly, its feathers matted, a picture of desolation. I stooped to pick up a stone and sent it skipping across the water. It vanished without a ripple. Everything about the lake felt tainted, charged with a palpable tension, as if it were holding its breath in anticipation. I, too, was waiting. I wasn't quite ready, but I would be. I refused to surrender this place to deceit, to the machinations of power, or to an association that believed its directives superseded the natural order, the rights of ownership, and the profound depths of grief. I was determined to remind them of the lake's true essence and the consequences of attempting to build upon a foundation that refused to be claimed. It began with a letter, delivered stealthily beneath my front door like a serpent's approach, a single sheet on Ridgepoint Meadows stationery. "This is your final notification. Continued obstruction of the Ridgepoint Meadows Floating Cafe project will be considered criminal trespass and harassment of construction personnel. You are hereby ordered to maintain a minimum distance of 200 feet from all construction zones at Ridgepoint Meadows Lake. Failure to comply may result in a restraining order and legal prosecution." It was unsigned, no one claiming authorship. Yet, the envelope bore the faint, cloying scent of gardenias, Karen's signature fragrance at every function. I contacted the law firm listed at the bottom of the letter. The receptionist placed me on hold, then returned with a voice that sounded pre-recorded. "Mr. Keller, our client possesses a valid conditional use permit. Kindly direct all future communications to the city attorney's office." The line went dead. 2 days later, an anonymous email arrived from a Gmail address. "Consider your next actions carefully. Accidents can occur on construction sites." I stared at the screen until the cursor blinked into dormancy. My palms grew slick. They weren't merely dismissing my concerns, they were actively attempting to intimidate me. The smear campaign that followed was equally deliberate. The subsequent Ridgepoint Meadows newsletter featured a front-page article titled "Safeguarding Our Community's Future from Misguided Anger." While my name was conspicuously absent, the implication was undeniable. It depicted a local resident who was selfishly hoarding resources intended for the collective and spreading false accusations regarding environmental harm. Neighbors I had known for years now crossed the street to avoid eye contact. Mrs. Levin, who had habitually brought me zucchini bread each summer, now looked down at her shoes when I offered a greeting. Even David Tran avoided me. He sent a single terse text, "Sorry, man, they're distorting everything." And then silence. I could feel them closing in, meticulously shaping the narrative. It was akin to a slow-motion mob, each individual convinced of their righteous stance, having been fed just enough self-congratulatory rhetoric to feel comfortable. One evening, as I was maneuvering my canoe ashore, a group of teenagers on the new floating boardwalk began shouting. "Hey, Lake Grinch!" one of them yelled. "Go back inside, old man!" Another chimed in. Their laughter echoed across the water. I clenched my jaw, my hands trembling, not with fear, but with a potent simmering anger that was beginning to feel dangerous. I forced myself to gently place the canoe down, resisting the urge to hurl it. Karen appeared the following day, her smile disarmingly sweet. "Tom," she began, "we've received numerous complaints regarding your conduct. Reports suggest you've been shouting at children and making threats towards contractors. We must take these allegations seriously." "I haven't shouted at anyone," I countered. She tilted her head, her expression patronizing. "Perception is reality, Tom. You're cultivating a hostile atmosphere. For everyone's benefit, it would be best if you simply stayed away from the lake until the grand opening." I let out a disbelieving laugh. "My lake? You're trespassing. You are the hostile environment." Her smile remained fixed. "The courts will determine that. Until then, let's endeavor to be good neighbors, shall we?" She patted the fence post as if it were a dog and departed. That night, I meticulously reviewed my amassed evidence, emails, correspondence, water samples, photographic documentation. I compiled and bound copies of everything and dispatched them to the city attorney, the county's environmental enforcement division, and even the local newspaper. I understood that much of it would likely be disregarded, but I felt compelled to create a verifiable record. The next morning, my mailbox was gone. Not damaged, but entirely vanished. The wooden post had been uprooted, and the metal box was nowhere to be found. A single note was left in its place. "You are making this more difficult for yourself." I drove to the HOA clubhouse, the folder of blueprints resting on the passenger seat. The parking lot was bustling. Some sort of special board meeting was in progress. I entered, bypassing startled volunteers, and proceeded to the main hall where Karen sat at the head of a long table. She appeared unsurprised. "Mr. Keller," she stated calmly, "this is a closed session. You've trespassed, polluted my lake, and stolen my property," I declared, placing the blueprints on the table. "You are in violation of county water rights, environmental statutes, and at least 4 provisions of the Ridgepoint Meadows Charter, and you know it." She folded her hands. "Do you have a court order to present?" "No, but I have 30 years of documentation and the original engineering plans." "This project is fundamentally unsafe." A murmur rippled through the assembled board members. Karen offered a thin smile. "Then perhaps you should present them to the city. I'm confident they will appreciate your input once the cafe is operational." Her unwavering confidence was a palpable blow. She understood the glacial pace of city bureaucracy. By the time my evidence reached the proper authorities, the cafe would be open, the narrative firmly established, and the lake effectively lost. I departed without another word. Driving home, Julie's face appeared vividly in my mind. The way she would smile at me when I became overly agitated about something. The gentle touch of her hand on mine as she'd say, "Breathe. Think." I parked the truck in the garage and sat in silence, the engine off, my gaze fixed on the blueprint tube on the passenger seat. Breathe. Think. They wanted me to crack, to make a mistake, to lash out so they could paint me as a criminal. Instead, I would do something different. I would do what my father had originally intended for this lake. I would act cleanly. I would act quietly, and I would act under the cover of darkness. On the night I made my decision, the lake was utterly tranquil. Not a whisper of a breeze, no moonlight, only the low thrum of construction generators emanating across the water like a mechanical heartbeat. It felt as though the entire environment were holding its breath, anticipating an inevitable event. I carefully laid the blueprint out on the workbench one final time. The paper, softened by years of handling, its edges slightly curled, still bore the precise details. Inlet gate coordinates, drain pipe diameters, the precise rotational angle of the crank arm, and the operational sequence. My father had inscribed notes in the margins in his neat all-capital lettering, warnings about water pressure, guidance on sediment flow, redundant fail-safes for winter blockages. He had engineered the drainage system to withstand any disaster, be it drought, heavy rainfall, or flash floods. Nothing had ever overwhelmed it, but no one had ever foreseen that the disaster would originate from above. I rolled the blueprint gently, slid it back into its protective tube, and tucked it behind a stack of lumber in the corner. Then I packed a duffel bag with the necessary tools, a flashlight, socket wrenches, valve grease, an old canvas harness, gloves, and 2 rusted but functional diving weights to secure myself while descending into the well shaft. I moved with a deliberate, almost somnambulant focus, not out of fear, but out of intense concentration. I wasn't engaging in sabotage, I wasn't destroying property, I was activating a safeguard, a system in place long before HOA boundaries or Karen's ambitions for a lakeside condominium existed. I was implementing precisely what the system was designed to do: manage overflow, protect the terrain, and restore the lake to its natural equilibrium. It just so happened that their restaurant was not built for equilibrium. It was built on illusion, and illusions rarely survive exposure. At 2:47 in the morning, I stepped into the water. I had mapped out the most efficient path across the shallows to the eastern inlet, the location of the release shaft concealed beneath the dense brambles. The usual chorus of frogs was absent. No herons, no bats, only myself, the lake, and the faint creak of the distant floating boardwalk. I knelt at the edge of the well. My breath misted in the cool night air. I paused, needing a moment. I thought of Julie, her gentle voice, her unwavering optimism. I wasn't certain whether she would approve of this action or be horrified. Perhaps both. But one thing I knew with absolute certainty: she would never want me to allow them to take everything. So, I lifted the hatch. It creaked open with a sound like a coffin lid. A wave of cold air rose from below, carrying the scent of damp earth and rust. I slipped the harness over my shoulders, cinched the weights around my belt, and began my descent into the darkness. The journey down was slower than I recalled. My boots scraped against the damp inner walls, and the rope chafed my gloves with every inch I lowered myself. When my feet finally touched the bottom, I was standing in water up to my waist, the icy chill seeping through my clothes. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the familiar silhouette of the crank housing, still in place, still waiting. The valve was protected by a steel cage. With 2 firm twists of the wrench, I unlocked the cover plate. Then I took the crank handle and began to turn it, slowly and deliberately, clockwise, just as the blueprint instructed. The mechanism groaned in protest. A low rumble echoed through the stone chamber, followed by the distinct rush of moving water from somewhere far below. I continued to turn. The pressure differential engaged more rapidly than I'd anticipated. Sediment began to flush, and the old sluice gates opened in stages, directing the flow into the lower runoff channel that ran beneath the ridge, ultimately emptying half a mile downstream into an abandoned ravine. I checked the flow gauges, mechanical dials my father had installed in the 1970s. They steadily climbed. Within 6 hours, the water level would begin to recede. Within 10, the floating restaurant would lose its stability. By dawn, it would be submerged. I felt no sense of triumph. This was not an act of revenge. It was an act of release. I climbed out of the well, carefully replaced the hatch, and erased my footprints from the nearby mud. No evidence, no discarded tools, no fingerprints, only the lake, still calm, still reflecting the faint glow of a half-realized dream. By the time I returned to my house, my clothes soaked and my body trembling, the clock read 4:13 in the morning. I made myself a cup of tea and waited. At first, nothing seemed to change. The restaurant lights still flickered like distant fireflies. The boardwalk swayed gently, but by 5:30, I noticed a subtle shift in the reflections on the water. The waterline had lowered by less than a foot, but it was enough. The cafe's platform did not adjust. They had not engineered it to accommodate changes in water depth. It had been designed for aesthetic buoyancy, stable only as long as the water level remained consistent. But my father's system disregarded aesthetics. It responded to pressure, gravity, and time. By 6:15, the metal anchor cables began to groan audibly across the lake. One of the floating walkways tilted precariously, sloshing water onto its deck. Two of the LED lights along the restaurant's edge shorted out with a hiss of sparks. The lake continued its slow, inexorable descent, calm, clear, and deliberate. At 6:42 in the morning, I heard the first scream, likely a contractor, arriving early for final inspections. I stood at the edge of the tree line, wrapped in my flannel jacket, tea in hand, and watched the unfolding chaos. He ran across the gravel path, shouting into his phone. The restaurant was now visibly tilting, one side nearly submerged, the other elevated like a sinking vessel. More workers arrived, then Karen. She came barreling down the HOA access road in her white Lexus SUV, her hair unbrushed, clutching a coffee cup she never sipped. Her mouth fell open as she took in the scene, the platform lurching sideways, furniture inside rolling, banners tearing from their mounts. She screamed something incoherent, gestured frantically at the water, and then stumbled back as the central float beneath the kitchen area gave way. A surge of water erupted upwards as the structure cracked at its midpoint, folding in on itself, pulling the decking into a twisted arch. The entire edifice groaned like a dying leviathan before collapsing with a thunderous splash, followed by an unnerving silence. Water swelled across the lake's surface in gentle waves, lapping at the untouched shoreline. Steam rose from short-circuited electrical components. A curtain of silence descended. No applause, no sirens, no sound. Just Karen, standing ankle-deep in mud, mascara streaking her face, a bleeding cut on her cheek. She looked across the water directly at me. Our eyes met, and for the first time since this conflict began, she appeared genuinely afraid. The official incident report would later attribute the event to unexpected structural failure due to unstable flotation infrastructure exacerbated by rapid changes in water level. But I knew the truth, and so did Karen. By 7 o'clock, the entire floating restaurant had disintegrated into a chaotic jumble of warped metal and waterlogged beams. Half of it lay submerged at a 45-degree angle. The main dining platform had split down the center, the overhead awning now drooping like a broken wing. From my vantage point in the trees, I could see the tips of chairs and shattered light fixtures bobbing like debris after a shipwreck. The water level had dropped just under 4 feet, enough to disrupt everything, enough to expose the falsehoods they had constructed on instability, on presumption, on a lake they did not truly own. And when the foundation receded, when the quiet, natural forces beneath them shifted, they were rendered powerless. Karen's screams echoed across the banks, raw and uncontrolled. I had never witnessed such a complete unraveling. Her windbreaker was soaked from the knees down, and her platinum hair, usually meticulously styled as if for battle, clung wetly to her forehead. She paced in frantic circles, waving her phone in the air, barking orders at no one who would listen. I maintained my distance. By 7:15, Ridgepoint Meadows residents began to emerge, drawn by the approaching sirens and the escalating panic on the HOA group chat. They arrived in robes, workout attire, coffee cups in hand. I could hear their confused murmurs as they gathered near the dock, staring out at the floating disaster. What happened? Was there a storm last night? Is it sinking? No one even told us it was open yet. Someone filmed the scene with their phone. Another person live-streamed it to the HOA Facebook page, their voice trembling as they narrated Karen's meltdown beside the smoldering wreckage. A child asked if the lake was broken. His mother quickly pulled him away. I stood in the shadows of the tree line, arms crossed, my expression unreadable. Then the emergency vehicles began to arrive. First, a local fire unit, red lights flashing silently. Then, a municipal code enforcement SUV. Finally, a Black City Environmental Protection van, a department familiar to me from years of responding to flood infrastructure emergencies. Laura Steele stepped out. I hadn't seen her in nearly 12 years. She wore a navy utility vest over a crisp shirt, her hair pulled into a high ponytail, a clipboard already in hand. She looked older, sharper, but just as no-nonsense as the last time I saw her surveying a collapsed culvert outside Durango. When our eyes met, her brow furrowed slightly, a flicker of recognition, surprise, and something akin to understanding passing across her face. She walked directly towards the shoreline. Karen intercepted her, breathless. "There's been sabotage," Karen exclaimed, waving her hands frantically. "We suspect a resident may have tampered with the water levels. This entire project is under threat, and we need to secure the area immediately. I want this entire lake cordoned off and a full investigation into—" Laura cut her off calmly. "Do you have a completed permit for this structure?" Karen blinked. "We have a conditional permit. It's been pending final review, meaning construction wasn't approved yet." "Well, technically, it was pre-approved for inspection. Was a safety impact report filed?" Karen hesitated. Laura turned and gazed out at the floating ruin. "I will need to see all zoning documents, contractor files, and environmental impact assessments by the end of the day," she stated flatly. "And no one is to approach that water until my team has completed their sampling." Karen's face flushed crimson. "But this is Ridgepoint Meadows Lake. We have civic use rights under pending reclassification." Laura didn't even flinch. According to the city plat, this lake is privately owned. That single sentence rippled through the assembled crowd like a dropped stone. Several residents exchanged confused glances. "I thought it was community property," one woman murmured. "Didn't we receive a letter about it being shared?" Karen stiffened. "We were under the impression—" "No," Laura stated, her voice now loud enough for everyone to hear. "Laura, no," Karen stammered, but Laura continued, her gaze unwavering. "According to the city plat, this lake is privately owned. This expanse of land and this tranquil water are officially recognized as Parcel 12C. It has never been integrated into the Homeowners Association territory of Ridgepoint Meadows. I recall personally approving the initial conservation designation in the year 2009. Whispers began to circulate. Karen's lips parted, but no sound emerged. Laura's team sprang into action. 2 individuals, clad in protective gear, entered the water carrying sampling equipment. One of them pointed out a sheen near the submerged kitchen structure. Another marked patches of algae with bright orange tape. A drone operator dispatched a small aerial unit to capture the full extent of the damage. At that moment, I could have stepped forward, created a scene, and declared that I had emptied the lake, that I possessed every right to do so, that I had issued warnings, and that no one had heeded them, but I refrained because it was unnecessary. The lake had already spoken on my behalf, and when nature makes its voice heard, it does so, not with a roar, but with a gentle tug, a subtle shift, a quiet reclamation. By mid-morning, Karen was seated in the rear of a fire department vehicle, wrapped in a blanket, her voice a jumble of fragmented sentences directed at someone on a speakerphone. 2 members of the board were engaged in a heated discussion on the sidewalk, debating who bore responsibility for the structural assessments. David TR stood by the roadside, his hands clasped atop his head, resembling someone who had just realized he had aligned himself with the losing side. Laura located me an hour later, seated on the tailgate of my truck beneath a pine tree. Initially, she remained silent, simply offering me a bottle of water before sitting beside me. "I presumed you'd still be around," she remarked eventually. "However, I hadn't anticipated finding you at the heart of a controversy." I offered her a weary smile. "It's not my controversy." She slowly nodded, yet added, "But it was your lake." We sat in quiet contemplation, observing as city vehicles meticulously removed the sodden debris piece by sodden piece. Each fragment of plastic and metal hauled away felt like a burden lifted from the water's surface. The more they removed, the clearer the lake appeared, as if undergoing a visible healing process. Laura turned to me. "Did you open the valve?" I offered no response. She didn't press the issue. Instead, she sighed. "I will submit a preliminary injunction that should effectively halt any future zoning claims. However, Tom, you may still face legal repercussions." "I understand." Was it worth the effort? I thought of Julie, the birds, the dock, the profound quietude of the water. "Yes," I affirmed. By midday, the media had descended. First, a local news van with a faded emblem arrived, driven by a young man who appeared barely old enough to operate a vehicle, clutching a boom microphone. This was followed by a regional news crew, featuring a blonde anchor in high heels, navigating muddy puddles in search of a dramatic backdrop. Finally, a news helicopter began to circle overhead, its rotors beating the air as if sounding a war cry. The Homeowners Association had sought public attention. Now, they had it in abundance. However, this was no longer a celebratory ribbon-cutting event. This was disaster coverage, complete with B-roll footage of sunken pontoons, aerial views of algal blooms, and wide shots of bewildered residents clad in pajamas, questioning how their association dues had funded such a spectacle. Karen was nowhere to be seen. Rumor had it she had departed in the back of a city enforcement vehicle, not under arrest, but certainly no longer in command. The HOA board had fallen silent. Their website displayed only a temporary placeholder page stating, "Under maintenance. Thank you for your patience." Their Facebook group, once a vibrant hub of performative cheerfulness and neighborhood chatter, was now restricted to new posts. Nevertheless, screenshots circulated rapidly. One post in particular went viral. HOA sinks $2 million restaurant into private lake, blames the lake. The comments beneath it were scathing. Some expressed anger, others found humor, but all were undeniably damning. While my name was not explicitly mentioned, the article quoted a long-standing property owner who had lodged complaints for months and was purportedly in possession of historical environmental blueprints that contradicted the HOA's claims. The wording was carefully chosen, yet everyone in Ridgepoint Meadows understood precisely who was being referenced. Suddenly, I was no longer the antagonist. I was an enigma, a spectral figure wielding a deed and a valve. I attempted to resist its influence, but I would be disingenuous if I denied a part of me. A small, wounded, weary part felt a profound sense of vindication, watching Karen's floating spectacle decay beneath the waterline. Yet, I was not yet free. That afternoon, I received a call from the city attorney's office. The woman who identified herself as Mara Epstein's civil litigation liaison addressed me. "Mr. Keller," she stated, "I have reviewed the documents you submitted, including the original water rights deed, the plat maps, and the scanned blueprints. May I confirm, are you asserting that the HOA proceeded with construction on your property without your explicit authorization?" "Yes," I replied simply. "And are you prepared to provide sworn testimony to that effect?" "I am," I confirmed. She paused. "We have also received a communication from the Ridgepoint Meadows legal team alleging that you caused malicious damage to the structure by manipulating the water level." "They are entitled to allege whatever they wish. They are pushing for charges of criminal negligence." My pulse began to quicken. I did not damage anything. I did not tamper with their platform. All I did was open a floodgate designed for water management, a system installed long before Ridgepoint Meadows was even conceived. Another pause. Is that accurate? I have the maintenance logs to substantiate this, the flow rate data, and the sediment analysis. The city itself approved that system in 1975. She inhaled, and I could hear the sound of her typing. I will schedule a deposition. In the interim, do not engage directly with any HOA members. If anyone attempts to contact or intimidate you, please report it to my office. I've already had one mailbox vanish. I will ensure that is included in the record. We concluded our conversation. The legal battle had officially commenced. I harbored no particular concern about achieving victory. I possessed the truth on my side, along with evidence and the passage of time. However, I was apprehensive about the lengths to which they would go to distort their narrative, and indeed the following morning, an editorial appeared in the county newspaper, its headline proclaiming, "When one man obstructs progress, the dark side of NIMBYism." The piece continued, "In every community, there exists an individual who clings so tenaciously to the past that they are willing to submerge the future. We must ponder, at what juncture does personal entitlement transform into societal obstruction?" Although unsigned, the voice was unmistakably familiar. I recognized it as Karen's. This was her final attempt to portray herself as a visionary, stifled by old resentments, to paint me as a bitter relic hoarding beauty while the world advanced. It might have succeeded were it not for the subsequent report. That afternoon, Laura returned, accompanied by her environmental assessment team. She held a clipboard in one hand and a sealed bag in the other. "We've conducted water tests," she announced, "at 3 distinct locations. Your concerns regarding runoff were substantiated. Fuel contamination from the construction barges, elevated levels of detergents and chemical stabilizers. One sample even showed a heightened presence of E. coli, likely due to improperly stored waste." I remained silent, my assent unspoken. "They didn't merely infringe upon zoning regulations," she continued. "They violated 3 city health codes and 2 environmental protection ordinances." She presented me with a copy of the report. "And this," she added, holding out the bag, "was discovered embedded in the mud near the cafe's eastern float. It's a broken mooring cable." Inside the bag was a frayed section of steel line, darkened with oil. They had alleged sabotage, claiming I had tampered with their anchors. However, this cable had snapped under stress, not from deliberate cutting. "Your valve did indeed lower the water level," she explained, "but the structural failure was a result of their own engineering." A profound sense of release, not of joy or even relief, but simply of breath, washed over me. It felt as though I had been submerged all this time without realizing it. That evening I sat on the dock, my legs dangling over the edge, just as I used to do with Julie. The lake had regained its tranquility. The water level was lower, but clearer. The algae was diminishing. A solitary egret alighted on the opposite bank near the cattails, standing perfectly motionless, as if granting me permission to exhale. A gentle knock interrupted the silence. It was David Tran. He stood somewhat awkwardly at the end of my driveway, holding 2 bottles of beer. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he began. "I remained silent, but I believe you were right from the outset, and I apologize for not speaking up sooner." I gestured towards the bench beside the dock. He walked over and sat down. We drank in companionable silence. For the first time in months, the quiet was not oppressive. The lake once again reflected the stars and the falsehoods, those meticulously constructed on paper, on pride, and on superficial politeness, had finally been submerged. The lawsuit arrived 2 weeks later, delivered by courier, mid-morning, in a manila envelope heavy with accusations. The titles were stacked like ammunition: property interference, reckless negligence, willful endangerment, environmental sabotage. The plaintiff, the Ridgepoint Meadows Homeowners Association. The defendant, me. I was not surprised. I had been anticipating it. Inside was a 67-page complaint, dense with legal jargon, interspersed with photographs of the collapsed floating restaurant, a detailed list of damages exceeding $2.3 million, and allegations that I had deliberately manipulated water flow to sabotage a civic structure intended for community benefit. They even claimed emotional distress on behalf of Karen Whitfield, asserting that she had suffered irreparable reputational damage directly resulting from Mr. Keller's actions. That particular assertion almost provoked a laugh. Almost. I sat in my kitchen and read the entire document from beginning to end. Then I carefully placed it back into the envelope, poured myself a cup of coffee, and dialed a number I had been saving for over a decade, Donna Landon. We had collaborated once, years ago, on an environmental remediation project outside of Denver. At that time, she was a city attorney, possessing a sharp intellect with the law and an unwillingness to shy away from hands-on work. The last I had heard, she had transitioned to private practice specializing in land use and water rights. When she answered, her voice remained unchanged. "Keller," she exclaimed, her tone bordering on incredulous. "You're still alive?" "Barely. Are you still taking clients? I'm guessing this isn't about a parking ticket." "An HOA built a floating restaurant on my lake." A pause. "On your lake?" "They claimed it was theirs. I opened an old drainage valve. The restaurant sank. Now they're suing me for $2 million. Another pause, followed by a low, impressed whistle. "I'm listening." Within 48 hours, Dana drove up from Boulder, accompanied by a briefcase brimming with statutory printouts and a fierce clarity that I hadn't experienced in weeks. She remained in town for 3 days. We walked the shoreline. She meticulously reviewed every document I possessed: property deeds, zoning maps, environmental certifications, the blueprints from my father, the flow data, and even the water quality reports from Laura's team. Her eyes lit up when she examined the nitrate levels. "This alone," she declared, "could result in federal fines for them." The following Monday, she filed a countersuit: trespassing, environmental degradation, property theft, defamation, and harassment. Within a week, the local newspaper featured a new headline: HOA faces countersuit in lake collapse scandal. The atmosphere in Ridgepoint Meadows shifted almost overnight. Neighbors who hadn't spoken to me in months now waved from their driveways. One resident left a handwritten note in my mailbox: "I'm sorry, I didn't know. Thank you for protecting the lake." Then, the true unraveling commenced. Karen was compelled to resign from her position on the board. While not initially publicized, word eventually leaked that the city had issued a cease and desist order prohibiting any future HOA-led development until the investigation was concluded. Several contractors filed claims for unpaid invoices. The Ridgepoint Meadows HOA bank account was frozen pending litigation. Dana worked with relentless intensity. Each day she sent me updates with subject lines like "another nail in the coffin" or "city filing confirms water rights in your favor." She even uncovered that the HOA had never finalized the conditional permit they claimed to possess. Their entire construction endeavor had been predicated on a temporary approval that expired weeks before the platform was erected. They were aware of this, yet they proceeded with construction anyway. And when it collapsed, quite literally, they attempted to shift the blame onto me. By late autumn, the legal team representing Ridgepoint Meadows reached out discreetly. They expressed a desire to settle. Dana smiled when she read the email. "It's always a good sign," she remarked, "when the bully starts whispering." Their offer was to drop their lawsuit if I dropped mine. They would issue a public apology, relinquish all HOA claims to the lake, and fund an ecological restoration project to rectify the damage caused by the cafe. They even proposed to cover my legal fees. I should have accepted. I did not. Not yet. Because there was one condition, a requirement that no legal brief could adequately capture. I desired the lake to be officially, legally, and publicly designated by a name, not Ridgepoint Meadows Lake, nor Community Waters, but Julie's Lake. Dana raised an eyebrow when I conveyed this request. "That's what you want?" "That's all I want." She made it happen. It turned out that under Colorado's waterway naming provisions, a landowner could petition for an official designation if the body of water was situated entirely within their parcel and no prior designation existed. She submitted the necessary paperwork, gathered signatures, presented the environmental history, and attached Julie's obituary. 2 months later, I received a letter from the state. In accordance with Land Use Code 7.2a and 2a, the lake, formerly known as Parcel 12C, had been officially recorded as Julie's Lake. I did not weep when I opened the correspondence. I simply folded it, placed it in the drawer beside her wedding ring, and walked down to the dock. The sun was cresting the ridge, and the lake, her lake, remained tranquil and vibrant. The floating restaurant was long gone, dismantled piece by piece down to the very last bolt. The algal bloom had cleared. The heron had returned. One of them glided low over the surface as I stepped onto the dock, as if welcoming me home. Later that afternoon, I stood before a gathering of neighbors, some from Ridgepoint Meadows, others from the wider county, as the city unveiled the final placard at the public trailhead. Julie's Lake, a protected private watershed. I delivered no speech. It was unnecessary. Karen was nowhere to be seen. The board had been reorganized, this time with a new president who met my gaze and shook my hand. "It will not happen again," he assured me. "You have our word." I nodded, because now they understood not only that the lake belonged to me, but that some things transcend mere property. Some things represent legacy, some things are sacred, and if they are worth building upon, they are certainly worth protecting. The following spring, the lake bloomed anew. One would never guess what had transpired if they hadn't lived through it. The surface shimmered as it always had, glassy and pristine, kissed by morning mist and fringed with wildflowers. The trees stood taller, greener, and the birds returned in full chorus. It felt as though the very land was exhaling, finally, after everything. And I, too, was breathing. For the first time in years, the air no longer felt constricted in my chest. The anger that had coiled itself into the corners of my ribs began to dissipate. Not because the struggle had been easy, it hadn't been, and not because I had gained wealth or acclaim. Neither held any significance for me. It was because I had accomplished something meaningful, something Julie would have comprehended, something larger than personal pride. I had safeguarded what was hers, what was ours. I had saved her lake. I recall standing on the dock that April morning, barefoot, a steaming cup of coffee in my hand, and watching a line of goslings waddle across the far bank. Their mother patiently guided them, one by one, into the water. They floated like miniature lanterns, bright and blinking against the surface. Peace, I realized, does not arrive all at once. It materializes in fragments, small and quiet, a bird returning to its familiar nest, a breeze devoid of tension, a neighbor waving with genuine intent. Even the HOA underwent a transformation. The new board president, Mark Delling, proved to be more than just courteous. He was a retired firefighter with an affinity for ecology and a clear, organized approach to paperwork. He met with me personally each month to review HOA boundaries and pledged complete transparency. One day, he even assisted me in planting new willow saplings near the southern bank, where the Café had once floated. "You were right," he remarked, patting the soil firmly. "We forgot this place has a soul." It was more than just words. The HOA voted to fund a shoreline buffer project focused on eradicating invasive plants and re-establishing native habitats. They established an environmental stewardship committee and, to my utter astonishment, invited me to chair it. Initially, I declined, but eventually I agreed, subject to one condition. No meetings were to be held within the HOA clubhouse. We would convene at the lake, always. And so, we did. Every first Saturday, we gathered in a circle on folding chairs beneath the pines, conversing like neighbors once more, not adversaries. It took time. There were still occasional sideways glances. A few residents who would have preferred to forget the entire ordeal ever occurred. However, most remained, most listened, and some even offered apologies. David TR attended every meeting, quiet, helpful, and evidently remorseful. One evening, after assisting with trash cleanup near the dock, he lingered behind. "I read the court filings," he stated. "All of them. I had no idea how extensive they were." "They gambled on your ignorance," I responded. He nodded. I want to be better than that. I believed him. Even Laura Gruff Citycode, as she was affectionately known, visited occasionally, appearing more relaxed now. She brought her dog, allowing it to splash in the shallows while we discussed watershed restoration. Once she sat beside me at dusk and commented, "You know, this place feels sacred. Not merely protected, but sacred." I smiled. It is. We watched the sunset paint ripples across the water. For a considerable period, we remained in silence. Then she inquired, "Do you ever regret what you did?" I contemplated the question, the sleepless nights, the smear campaigns, the vanished mailbox, the courtrooms, the whispering neighbors. I recalled Julie's face in my memory as I stood over that valve and the profound urge to abandon it all, and I answered honestly, "No," I said. "But I do wish it hadn't come to that, because I never desired a conflict. I never intended to dismantle anything. I simply wanted to be left undisturbed with the memories I still held. However, they would not permit it, so I reminded them that ownership extends beyond the confines of a plat map, that not everything can be quantified in monetary terms or development potential, that certain things, certain places, possess a weight that remains unseen until someone attempts to seize it. I did not drain the lake out of malice. I did it to reveal the truth. And in doing so, I reclaimed more than just a body of water. I reclaimed myself. Now, each morning, I traverse the perimeter with my dog, Maggie. She's an elderly rescue hound with ears disproportionately large for her frame and a bark that rivals the birds in volume, but she cherishes the lake. She wades in like a child, chasing shadows and leaves. Sometimes we sit together on the dock, and I converse with her as I once did with Julie. I recount the day the heron returned, the frog songs that recommenced after the water cleared, the time a group of teenagers offered to help me replant native reeds. And once I shared the entire narrative from beginning to end. She, of course, did not comprehend, but she listened intently, and when I concluded, she licked my hand, rested her head on my knee, and let out a sigh so profound it seemed to emanate from both of us. The lake shimmered behind her, still in quietude,